Joan Baez has long been recognized for her beautiful voice and for captivating an entire generation of Americans with her music. But behind the curtain of fame, behind the iconic relationships with legends like Steve Jobs and Bob Dylan, and performances alongside Martin Luther King Jr., a more private and somber reality began to take shape. Now 83, the famed folk singer has traded sold-out concerts for quiet days in nature. She seeks solace in trees, which she affectionately calls her counselors, and spends time alone in her peaceful home, talking to plants, climbing into her treehouse, and facing the shadows of a painful childhood. Joan's journey began long before her first standing ovation. Her father, Albert Baez, was a brilliant scientist who helped develop early X-ray technology, yet it was his moral compass that made him stand out. During the Cold War, he turned down lucrative defense jobs, unwilling to participate in weapons research. Instead, he chose less prestigious work, often partnering with universities and organizations like UNESCO. He instilled in his family a belief that material comforts were secondary to doing what was right. That commitment would leave a deep imprint on Joan's life. As a child, Joan's family moved often, including a pivotal period in Baghdad. There, her father helped establish science programs at a local college. At just 17, Joan was thrust into a world marked by extreme contrasts. She vividly remembered the heat and chaos of arriving in Iraq, witnessing a beggar being beaten by police at the airport, and seeing children digging through trash while animals were abused in the streets. During that period, she read the diary of Anne Frank and fell ill often. Years later, she would reflect on that time as a turning point, when her young soul awakened to the injustice around her and her understanding of the world deepened. Back in California, Joan began to notice injustice closer to home. Though born in New York, her Mexican heritage made her feel like an outsider. At school, she was mocked by white classmates as a stupid Mexican, but she also didn't fully belong among Mexican peers because she didn't speak Spanish. Living between two worlds helped sharpen her sensitivity to right and wrong. "I was brown and not welcome," she said. But she also realized that others, particularly Black Americans, faced even greater discrimination. That awareness would later shape her decisions, such as refusing to perform for segregated white audiences in the South, instead choosing to sing at black schools, even when it jeopardized her career. Joan's moral foundation was strengthened further when, at 8, her family became Quakers. Known for their deep commitment to peace and justice, Quaker values became central to her own life. She recalled overhearing dinnertime conversations about war and morality, and at age 15, she was moved to tears by a speech from Martin Luther King Jr. Soon after, she made headlines for refusing to participate in a Cold War air raid drill, marking her first public act of defiance and the beginning of a lifelong calling. Everything changed in the summer of 1959 at the Newport Folk Festival. Joan, then just 18 and still unknown, stepped on stage with a borrowed guitar and sang 2 songs. Her voice, clear and hauntingly pure, stunned the crowd into silence. That one performance, alongside legends like Pete Seeger and Bo Diddley, turned her into the festival's breakout star. Record labels rushed to sign her, and she would return to Newport for decades, even performing into her 80s. But it was that magical night in 1959 that launched her into fame. Just a year later, at 19, she recorded her first album in a rundown hall at Manhattan Towers in New York. There was nothing glamorous about it. She sat on a hotel bed with a dirty mattress, 2 microphones, and the hum of board games being played in the next room. Yet the rawness of the setting helped capture something rare: honesty. Although the album didn't top the charts right away, it slowly climbed and eventually reached number 15, staying there for nearly 3 years. Instead of signing with a major label like Columbia, Joan chose the lesser-known Vanguard Records because they promised her creative freedom. That decision paid off. Years later, the Library of Congress would recognize one of her earliest songs as historically significant, a testament to how her voice, grounded in truth and justice, transcended the commercial music world and became something far more powerful. Before Joan Baez became a household name, she was quietly building her confidence on small stages. One of the most formative places was Club 47, a humble venue near Harvard in Cambridge. When she first performed there, the room was nearly empty. She felt nervous, uncertain, but unmistakably memorable. There was something enigmatic about her, something people didn't forget. Within weeks, the crowds grew, and lines stretched out the door. Her pay rose from $10 a night to $25, which was considerable for a young folk singer performing in coffee houses. That tiny stage in 1959 became her proving ground, a place where she refined her voice and began to shape her identity. Joan's bare feet became a quiet symbol of defiance. It started at Newport, where she famously performed without shoes. At first, it was just a quirky detail, but over time, it came to represent her authenticity and her rejection of the polished, commercial side of the music industry. People began to see her as a saint, though she resisted the label. "I am not a saint," she once said. "I am a noise." Despite the pressure to live up to an ideal, she eventually found peace. In her 80s, dancing barefoot on the streets of Paris, she was no longer performing for approval, she was simply being herself. In 1961, Joan's life shifted once more when she stepped into a club in Greenwich Village and heard a scruffy young man named Bob Dylan sing a tribute to Woody Guthrie. Joan was already an established star by then, but Dylan was new to the scene. His voice was raw, his phrasing unpolished, but his lyrics stunned her. She later recalled how deeply the performance affected her, saying it broke something open inside her. A bond formed quickly. At a party not long after, Dylan sang "With God on Our Side," and Joan knew he was more than just talented, he was a force. Over the next few years, Joan used her fame to amplify Dylan's rising star. In 1963, she invited him to perform with her at the Newport Folk Festival before an audience of 10,000. The crowd didn't know what to make of him at first, but Joan believed in him. She brought him on tour, shared her stage, and introduced his songs to her audiences. During one performance in Queens, more than half her set was dedicated to Dylan's songs. Critics and fans alike agreed, Bob Dylan gave voice to a generation's silent thoughts. Together, Joan and Dylan stood at the March on Washington in 1963, the same day Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his "I Have a Dream" speech. Dylan was no longer just a folk singer, he had become a voice of the civil rights movement, thanks in part to Joan's support. But their partnership was not built to last. By 1965, Dylan had outgrown the relationship. He invited Joan on tour in the UK, only to exclude her from performing once they arrived. She found herself backstage, confused and heartbroken, unsure why he pushed her aside. Around the same time, Dylan married a woman named Sarah, who was already pregnant with his child. Years later, Joan reflected that Dylan had broken her heart, not just as a lover, but as someone she deeply admired. He chose stability and control, and there was no room for Joan in that vision. In 1968, still reeling from the emotional fallout, Joan released an album titled Any Day Now, composed entirely of Bob Dylan's songs. She selected them randomly from sheets of his music scattered on the floor, interpreting some songs he had never even recorded. Critics were harsh at first, but many praised her haunting version of Tears of Rage. Joan even created the album's artwork herself. It wasn't just a musical project, it was a reckoning with all they had shared and all that had slipped away. Joan's commitment to justice was never just lip service. In the summer of 1963, at only 22 years old, she stood before a massive crowd at the March on Washington and sang "We Shall Overcome" just before Dr. King took the podium. She had experienced racism herself, her father was Mexican, her mother Scottish, and their family had faced prejudice firsthand. That early pain became the foundation of her activism. Just 4 years earlier, she had been the breakout act at Newport. Now, her voice rang out across the National Mall, part of a movement that would change the course of history. Roughly 250,000 people attended the March on Washington, and it helped propel the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Joan's voice became not only the soundtrack to that pivotal moment but a lasting symbol of the power music could have in shaping hearts and minds. She was no longer just a singer, she had become a part of history. One of Joan Baez's most iconic moments came during the historic Selma to Montgomery marches in 1965. These protests followed the brutal events of Bloody Sunday, when peaceful marchers were viciously attacked by police on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Baez joined thousands of others in walking the 54-mile journey from Selma to Montgomery. Photographs from the time show her not on a pedestal, but walking side by side with ordinary people, talking, listening, and standing firm in her beliefs. On the eve of the final rally at the Alabama state capitol, she performed at a concert called Stars for Freedom, sharing the stage with legendary voices like Nina Simone, Harry Belafonte, and Tony Bennett. It was more than just a show, it was a powerful expression of solidarity through music. Later that year, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act into law. Throughout the early 1960s, Joan refused to perform at venues or schools that upheld segregation. While many Southern institutions still barred black students, she chose instead to perform at historically black colleges and universities, a bold, risky decision that could have damaged her career or even endangered her safety. At Miles College in Alabama, she arrived just in time to avoid a wave of arrests ordered by the notorious police chief Bull Connor. She had to stay in one of the few hotels that welcomed both black and white guests. That experience reinforced her resolve. While Martin Luther King Jr. and his peers often spoke of fairness and equality, Joan was living it, facing the fear and making the hard choices in real time. In 1964, Joan made a radical personal choice: she refused to pay 60% of her income taxes. Her reasoning was simple: the money would fund the Vietnam War, which she fiercely opposed. This act of civil disobedience placed her among the first prominent Americans to protest the war through tax resistance. Others soon followed, and the movement grew. By 1967, Joan's protests escalated. That year, she was arrested twice for nonviolent demonstrations, including one outside a military base in Oakland, California. Her mother was arrested alongside her, and they spent over a month in jail. Many viewed this as a powerful example of principled, peaceful defiance. As the anti-war movement intensified in the early 1970s, more Americans joined the resistance by refusing to pay war-related taxes or even phone bills that contributed to the war effort. But Joan went further than most. In December 1972, she traveled directly into a war zone, North Vietnam, accompanied by a group of peace activists. Their mission was to deliver Christmas cards to American POWs and call attention to human rights. However, during their visit, the U.S. launched a brutal bombing campaign over Hanoi that lasted 11 days. Joan sheltered in a hotel as bombs exploded around her. She documented the destruction: a playground reduced to rubble, a Christmas Eve church service silenced by an air raid. It was the first time she genuinely feared for her life, and the memory haunted her forever. Even before this, in 1965, Joan had begun turning her fame into long-term activism by co-founding the Institute for the Study of Nonviolence in Carmel Valley, California. With her mentor Ira San Pearl, she built a center for training young people in the philosophies of Gandhi and peaceful resistance. Locals opposed the project, fearing an influx of hippies, and tried to block the school through legal means. Undeterred, Joan pressed on, reopening quietly that December. The school taught not only theory but also practical skills: how to write, organize, and speak out. After 4 years in Carmel, the institute moved to Palo Alto and eventually became a peace resource center in Santa Cruz. Joan continued to be a powerful voice for justice on multiple fronts. At the height of the Vietnam War, she helped publish a full-page ad in major newspapers condemning the North Vietnamese government's human rights abuses, urging them to allow Red Cross inspections in their prisons. This shocked many in the peace movement. Some activists, including Jane Fonda, strongly supported the North Vietnamese regime and took offense. The moment revealed a painful truth: even within the anti-war movement, deep ideological divides could tear friends apart. By 1991, at the age of 50, Joan confronted her most personal and painful truth. She wrote an open letter to her parents, accusing her father of having abused her as a child. He denied the allegations, claiming they were false memories implanted by therapy. Joan later admitted she wasn't completely certain of the details, but said that even if 20% of it were true, the emotional damage was real. The memories, ambiguous and haunting, stayed with her. Despite the pain, she eventually forgave her father before his death in 2007. In his final days, she sang to him as he sat quietly, one last intimate moment between father and daughter. Behind her public activism and music, Joan battled deep internal struggles. She experienced episodes of anxiety, depression, and severe panic attacks. At times, the weight of her past and the intensity of her convictions became almost too much to bear. Even during moments of joy, Joan Baez often found herself sinking into emotional lows. Happiness, for her, could be fleeting. She once admitted that her fluctuating mental state strained her relationship with her son, Gabriel. "I wasn't always there for him," she confessed. Though physically present, emotionally she sometimes wasn't, and the guilt of that stayed with her. Things worsened in the late 1970s and early 1980s, especially after the Vietnam War ended. She began drinking more, turning to tequila as a form of escape. At first, she joked that it felt like her new best friend, but the joke slowly became a coping mechanism, a sign that her strength was faltering. Thankfully, she had begun therapy early in life. In 1957, at just 16 years old, Joan told her parents that she was overwhelmed by feelings of sadness and a deep sense of inadequacy. That first therapy session marked the beginning of a lifelong commitment to understanding herself. Over the years, she saved cassette recordings from therapy sessions, documenting her emotional journey and trying to make sense of her life. Despite the inner battles, Joan never stopped making music. In 1970, she released One Day at a Time, an album that shocked many fans. Recorded at Bradley's Barn in Tennessee, it marked her first step into country music, a departure but a natural one. Her love for country had been shaped by her then-husband, David Harris, a talented singer and outspoken opponent of the Vietnam War who had been imprisoned for draft resistance. While he was in jail, Joan recorded songs in the country style he loved, including the tender Sweet Sir Galahad, which she wrote for David and her sister Mimi. During this time, Joan also explored other musical paths. Between 1966 and 1968, she collaborated with composer Paul Shaw and recorded several classical and Christmas albums, showing she wasn't afraid to defy expectations or genre boundaries. In 1974, Joan made another bold choice by recording an album almost entirely in Spanish, Gracias a la Vida. The timing was deliberate, coming just months after the death of Chilean folk singer Victor Jara, who was killed during a military coup. Though Spanish wasn't her native language, Joan sang with passion and precision, honoring Jara's memory and others like him. She even performed many of the songs live, connecting deeply with Spanish-speaking audiences across the world. Then came a song that would become one of the most iconic of her career. In 1974, during a phone call with Bob Dylan, he shared lyrics to his song The Lily, Rosemary, and the Jack of Hearts. That conversation inspired Joan to write Diamonds and Rust, a poignant reflection on their complicated relationship. The song captured the vulnerability and bittersweet memories between them. Her lyrics describe Dylan as the original unwashed phenomenon and the most important stranger she'd ever known. It was both tribute and goodbye. Another significant chapter in her life came with Steve Jobs. He was drawn to Joan not just for her beauty, but for her intelligence, integrity, and mystery. Their relationship lasted 3 years, and though Jobs reportedly considered marriage, Joan hesitated. She already had a teenage son, and she sensed Jobs wanted a different kind of life, one that included starting a family. There was one moment that stood out. While shopping at a Ralph Lauren store, Jobs told her she should wear a vibrant red dress she couldn't afford. Without hesitation, he bought it for her. It was a small gesture, but one she never forgot. In a 1972 interview, Joan opened up about a lesser-known part of her life, her relationship with a woman named Kim. The subject returned decades later in her 2023 documentary I Am a Noise. Kim was a free spirit who didn't care what people thought. Joan remembered the two of them walking through town in suspenders and messy hair, laughing like outlaws. That relationship, however brief, offered Joan a different, healing kind of love after the pain she had endured in past relationships. Leaving that part of her story out, she later said, would have felt dishonest. In her later years, Joan found peace in nature, particularly in the tree behind her house. She described climbing into it during summer as a magical ritual. She claimed she could feel the air from birds' wings as they flew past and once even fell from the tree, injuring herself and requiring a hospital visit. Still, she preferred the company of trees to that of doctors. Every morning, she said, I talk to the tree. Now in her 80s, she still dances barefoot to the music of the Gypsy Kings for 15 minutes each day. It's her way of staying grounded, of letting go. In 2020, Joan showcased a new side of herself with a solo art exhibition. Her pieces focused on themes of justice, freedom, and human rights, and they were met with warm acclaim. In 2021, she launched a second exhibition, this time featuring portraits of powerful modern figures like Kamala Harris, Greta Thunberg, and Dr. Anthony Fauci. Her portrait of Fauci, titled Trust, went viral. Even in visual art, her voice carried, still challenging, still moving, still unmistakably Joan. Through her art, Joan Baez continued her lifelong pursuit of justice, but in her later years, she began expressing it through a different medium. Her 2023 documentary, Joan Baez, I Am a Noise, offered a deeply intimate and often heartbreaking portrait of her life. For the first time, she publicly revealed the trauma she had kept hidden for decades, that she had been abused as a child, both emotionally and physically, by her father. These revelations added new layers of meaning to the songs she had written over the years, many of which, it turned out, were born directly out of her therapy sessions and emotional reckoning. Much of Baez's songwriting during the 1990s came from these private moments of reflection. She wrote not just to perform, but as a way to understand herself, to give voice to the many different parts of her identity. Her songs became a kind of internal dialogue, a form of therapy all their own. Rather than focus on gossip, scandals, or her famous romantic connections, she used her lyrics to explore deeper questions, memories of childhood, the struggle for healing, and the quiet strength it takes to grow after trauma. Among these songs was one described as a polite poem, a subtly crafted piece that touches on her long and complicated connection with Bob Dylan. It's not dramatic or bitter, but rather wistful, shaped by time and distance. The song gently evokes his presence in her life, more as a faded memory than a wound. In these later creative works, Baez revealed not only the scars of her past but also the grace and strength with which she had come to accept them.